What is a history fact that is so stupid it doesn't seem real? A prominent Roman politician, Publius Clodius Pulcher, dressed as a woman to infiltrate a woman's only religious ceremony in a futile effort to seduce Julius Caesar's wife. Not surprisingly, his plan didn't work. Charges were pressed and caused a very public legal battle for the next 2 years. At the insistence of his wife, none other than the famous Cicero came to prosecute the case. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Crassus, yes, the same Crassus of the first triumvirate and richest person in Rome at this point, bribed the jury and Pulcher was acquitted. In the meantime, Caesar divorced his wife over the affair. Surprisingly, though, this didn't tank Pulcher's career. Instead, it strengthened his alliance and he became a rather prominent politician. Once he gained more power, he was able to pass a law which retroactively applied to Cicero, banishing him from Rome and allowing the state to confiscate or destroy his property. While political enmity was present, much of it was also revenge. This isn't all. He also employed street gangs to do his bidding. They'd gather at opposing politicians' speeches and heckle them. They'd blockade roads so politicians couldn't make it to an important vote. They'd rough up people they didn't like. Another opposing politician, Milo, didn't care for this up and brought up his own street gangs. The difference was that Milo's gangs were trained by gladiators. General street violence erupted in the streets of Rome. The street violence caused 2 delays to important elections and eventually Milo caused the death of Pulcher in scuffle. When placed on trial, Milo had none other than Cicero, now returned from exile, be his defense lawyer. Despite his best efforts, Milo was exiled. Adolf Hitler had many physical ailments, many of which are known. He had in particular severe stomach cramps and also bouts of insomnia, so his quack doctor, Theodor Morell, in his infinite wisdom, gave Hitler sleeping pills and laxative, resulting in very severe gas problems. Everything Olga of Kiev did after her husband was killed by an opposing tribe. The opposing tribe killed him by tying his legs to trees they'd bent down and then releasing the trees. Cliffs, buried 20 men alive, burning another 20 alive after she lured them into a bathhouse. Slaughtered 5,000 of the opposing tribe soldiers after she'd gotten them drunk, telling the opposing tribe she'd end the assaults if each house gave her 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows. She then had her soldiers tie sulfur to each of the birds and set them free so that they would return home to nest in their original villages. Eventually the villagers' bedtime fires would ignite the sulfur and burn the town to the ground. Also, she's a saint in the Orthodox and Roman Catholic Church. Just off the top of my head, King Henry I died from eating a giant plate of lampreys, a type of small eel, too fast. Then American Vice President Andrew Johnson was so drunk at his vice presidential inauguration that he could not swear the new Congress in and rambled incoherently during his acceptance speech. Pope Stephen VI put the months-dead corpse of Pope Formosus on trial for crimes against the papacy, serving as a bishop without being appointed to the clergy, and a couple of other crimes too. He was dug up, propped up in a chair, and a deacon was made to stand behind the body and speak for him. Formosus was found guilty and punished by having his fingers chopped off and buried in an unmarked grave, but the conviction was annulled by a later pope and reinstated by one of that pope's successors. I believe Formosus is still considered guilty. The Roman Emperor Caligula once declared war on Poseidon and had his soldiers fight with the waves and collect conch shells as proof of their victory. The world's first submarine attack took place September 6, 1776 during the American Revolution. The craft was called the Turtle and was essentially a giant oak and metal Christmas ornament powered by 2 hand-cranked propellers. It was designed to attach waterproofed explosives to the hulls of British warships. However, the pilot kept hitting metal plating when trying to attach the bomb and abandoned the mission due to dwindling air supply. All subsequent missions were failures as well, and eventually the ship transporting the Turtle was sunk with the vessel on board. Also, during World War II, Americans tried to develop pigeon-guided missiles. The idea was that they would be guided by a pigeon inside the missile, pecking at the target, visible through a windshield in the missile. All the simulation tests proved it could be done, but sadly Project Pigeon, as it was called, was never given the funding it needed to become a reality. There was a genuine plan that was championed by its supporters for decades in the early 20th century to create a colossal dam across the Strait of Gibraltar in order to lower the sea level of the Mediterranean by roughly 200 meters. The plan was called Atlantropa, and those who believed in it thought it would lead to huge amounts of new land from the lowered coastline, unlimited energy from the hydroelectric dam, and improved relations throughout Europe and North Africa. These people apparently failed to realize that the new land would be salt pans, utterly useless for settling, and that there literally wasn't enough concrete on Earth to build the dam. Not one but two kings of France died by smashing their heads on the top part of a door. Charles VIII in 1498, the shock probably caused something else, but still. Louis III on the other hand was pursuing a fair lady who was actually trying to escape him on his horse on the 5th of August 882 when she passed a door. The horse went through, not the king, who broke his skull and died instantly. A man from New York missed his friends who were fighting in Vietnam, so he traveled thousands of miles to track them down in a combat zone, to personally give them beer and letters from home. He even wrote a book about it called The Greatest Beer Run Ever. Alright, I don't remember the specifics, but there was a king, I believe a Sumerian king, who was told by an oracle that disaster would befall the king. So he had a gardener crowned as king for a day, and that night the gardener would be executed, thus fulfilling the prophecy and saving the real king. Soon after the gardener's coronation, the real king choked on soup and died. The gardener ruled for 24 years. How the Berlin Wall fell. In order to calm mounting protests, GDR officials decided on loosening travel restrictions between East and West, not open the border completely. Notes of the new rules had been handed to a spokesman who hadn't had time to read them before the press conference. Private travel outside the country can now be applied for without prerequisites, he said. Surprised journalists clamored for more details. Shuffling through his notes, he said that as far as he was aware, it was effective immediately. In fact, it had been planned to start the next day, with details on applying for a visa. But the news was all over television, and East Germans flocked to the border in huge numbers. As the border became inundated with East Berliners wishing to reunite with family and or escape the GDR, border guards became overwhelmed, and with no orders to either shoot upon the crowd or open the gate, only a handful of guards facing hundreds and thousands of citizens, rather than fire and create a stampede and potentially kill hundreds, the head of the guards decided to give the order, open the barrier. What came next was a spontaneous chain reaction, with Berliners on both sides arriving at Checkpoint Charlie to celebrate this momentous event and to demolish the wall. So basically, an ill-prepared functionary made a flippant remark, and a border guard captain, unable to get orders on how to proceed, led to one of the most defining moments of the late 20th century in Europe. A Skylab satellite's guidance system was failing and ended up crash landing in Australia. Instead of giving the satellite back, Skylab was charged with a $500 littering fine. After the fine was paid, the company wanted to put the satellite in a museum, but was refused on the basis that, since the satellite fell from space, it's legally Australia's now. So now, Skylab pays a monthly rent to Australia to display its own satellite in a museum. During World War I, Germany converted and armed a passenger cruise liner, the SMS Cap Trafalgar, into a cruiser and sent to the Atlantic Ocean to disrupt British shipping. Off the coast of Brazil though, when they received word that a British ship was coming to flush out German ships disrupting British shipping, the SMS Cap Trafalgar decided to disguise itself as another ocean liner turned cruiser, the HMS Carmania, so that they wouldn't be shot at. The British ship that came to deal with the SMS Cap Trafalgar was the HMS Carmania, which promptly sunk the fake one. In 1956, a man named Tommy Fitzpatrick stole a small plane from New Jersey for a bet, and then landed it perfectly on the narrow street in front of the bar he had been drinking at in Manhattan. 2 years later, he did it again after someone didn't believe he had done it the first time. What's also crazy is that the punishment for the first time ended up being only a $100 fine, since the charges were dropped by the owner of the plane, and the second resulted in only 6 months in jail. Fidel Castro loved milk so much that when his cow, who holds the world record for most milk produced in a day, died, He had her taxidermied, had a marble statue of her built, and a full eulogy and obituary written for her in his state newspaper, and Cuban scientists have repeatedly tried, and failed, to clone her. Her name was Uba Blanca, which means white udder. The guy that my username was named after, King Alfred, pushed back the invading Viking armies, and then revolutionized the educational system, social system, legal system and like a dozen other things. There's a reason he's called Alfred the Great. He was also very famously yelled at by an old lady because he was too busy plotting a military campaign to watch the cakes that she had in the oven. I just find it silly that one of the greatest monarchs in English history was yelled at by an old lady for the same kinds of trivial things that people have been angry at each other over forever. It's an odd juxtaposition.